Hello friends! Today we will be building the repair ship that survived the Arizona explosion and lived through the rest of the war. It is none other than USS Vestal. She will be a vital part of our final diorama for the Pearl Harbor attack. For this build, I will be using the 700 scale resin kit from Corsair Armada, which is the only Vestal kit on the market right now. The plan is to assemble the kit for a dry fit, and then perform modifications including photo etch parts to have more details, followed by painting, decal, weathering and rigging. While I'm doing the dry fitting process, let's talk about USS Vestal. Vestal was launched in 1908 as a fleet collier. In 1913, she was converted to a fleet repair ship for the Atlantic Fleet. Vestal has a displacement of more than 12,000 tons, with a top speed of 16 knots. She is about 140 meters long, which is larger than typical destroyers of that period. She was equipped with 5-inch guns as well as .3 caliber machine guns, which were replaced by 20mm Oerlikons during World War II. During World War I, she was deployed to Ireland, providing repair services to the 1st Destroyer Flotilla. After the war, she received a modification converting her propulsion system from coal-powered to oil-powered. She was transferred to the Pacific Fleet in 1927 and moved to Pearl Harbor in 1940 together with the fleet. When the Pearl Harbor attack happened in 7th December 1941, she was moored at the port side of USS Arizona for scheduled service work. Coming back to our build, after dry fitting, the first thing I did was to drill out all windows along the ship hull. I then filled out the uneven surface on the hull with epoxy putty and smoothed the surface with sandpapers. My kit has a visible crack on the deck, so I fill it up with the same method and recreate the wooden strip pattern with a scraping blade. Now it's time to mention an important limitation of resin kit. It doesn't take extra thin cement, which means we cannot use it to remove small gaps like we do on plastic kit. Therefore, I have to glue the bridge with normal cement and fill up all the gaps with putty. The structure below funnel requires modification according to the instruction. The replacement part is included in this kit, so I only need to remove the old parts and replace it with the new one, followed by more putty to fill up the gaps. The rest of the parts are smooth sailing, so let's skip forward to photo etch parts. Although the instruction mentioned there's a PE set for this kit, I wasn't able to find it. So instead, I will be using the general PEs I have for the Arizona build. I added the clamps along the hull and also railings to the bow, because from this picture, I saw no railings at the stern. I found the 5-inch gun barrel too thick to be real, so I replaced them with some metal ones I found online. Overall, the modification for Vestal is way more pleasant compared to the Arizona build, thanks to better quality of this kit. After modifications are completed, I primed all the parts with a layer of putty. Although the kit does not include a painting diagram, it mentions Vestal is also using US Navy Measure 1 for 1941, just like USS Arizona. But first, I painted the deck with deck tan because there's no wooden deck this time, and then covered the paint with masking tape. US vessels have a black strip along the waterline, and Vestal is no exception according to this reference picture. And finally, for the hull and superstructures, I used dark grey with the same reason as the Arizona build, and the instruction of this kit supports this choice as well. For structure above funnel top, I used off-white. After I brush painted the chain in black as well as these motorboats, we have completed the painting process. Now it's time to put Vestal together, but I want to talk about her service record in World War II. On the morning of 7th December 1941, when the attack began, Vestal's crew manned every gun and fired at the invading aircrafts. Around 8:10 a.m., Arizona was hit by an armor-piercing round and her catastrophic explosion cleared the deck of Vestal, including her captain, Cassin Young, who bravely swam back to Vestal and cancelled the order to abandon ship. Instead, he ordered the ship to go underway. At 8:45 a.m., the crew managed to free her from mooring and eventually grounded on Aiya shore and saved the ship. After the attack, Cassin Young received a Medal of Honor for his brave action, and Vestal received a Battle Star for her courageous action during the attack. After supporting the repair work after the attack, Vestal was deployed to Tonga Islands in August 1942 to support operations in Guadalcanal. She repaired 58 ships, including carrier Saratoga and battleship South Dakota and North Carolina. She moved to Noumea in October in the same year, where she repaired carrier Enterprise and battleship South Dakota, which were damaged during the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands. She was then deployed to Espiritu Santo in November 1942 and stayed there for a year providing repair services. In November 1943, she moved to Funafuti and then Majuro Atoll in February 1944, where she repaired battleship Washington. After a needed repair in Murray Island Naval Yard, she went back to operation at Ulithi in October 1944. She then moved to Saipan in February 1945 and Karama Reto in May, and eventually Buckner Bay until Japan surrendered in August 1945. Vestal received 2 battle stars for her World War II service. After the war, she continued to support the decommission work of other ships. Until 1946, she was put out of service and scrapped in 1950. With the assembly done, I add decal for load lines and cover the model with a layer of gloss varnish. I then wash the details with Mr. Color Multi-Black to make them more pronounced, and then use the same to wash the hull vertically for more dynamic looking. Finally, I use oil paint to create a stain along the ship. I add the riggings by referring to this photo, and also climb ladders along each mast according to this photo. After adding flags made from decal and aluminum foil, we have completed the build for USS Vestal. Looking back the experience of building USS Vestal with this resin kit for Corsair Armada, it's much more pleasant and enjoyable. In total, I spent 60 hours on this build, which is less than half of Arizona's build. With both Arizona and Vestal completed, in next video, I will be building a diorama for these 2 ships with the most tragic moment of the Pearl Harbor attack. If you'd like to see more videos about ship models and historical diorama, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Until then, take care and I will see you soon.